And you can take it away.
Okay, thank you very much to Hannah, Kevin, Zach, and all the organisers for the opportunity to speak to you all today. So I'm Ryan MacDonald. I'm a research associate at Cornell University, and today I'll be kind of giving you a bit of an overview and a preview into some work that we're doing to try and further develop atmospheric retrieval tools as applied to exoplanet transmission spectra to try and extract more information from these spectra with both current and upcoming observational facilities. So whenever it comes to looking at the really big questions that we have in our field, the vast majority of these questions we can further address or develop by principally looking at the atmospheres of these exoplanets. So if we want to get some kind of constraints on planetary formation mechanisms by looking at the composition of atmospheres, or in the future with telescopes like James Webb, if we want to look at the atmospheres of rocky exoplanets and maybe even one day look for life in the universe, we need to have a technique that can convert remote measurements from telescopes like Hubble and James Webb into the underlying properties of these atmospheres. And that is the area that atmospheric retrieval tries to address. So how does it work? Let's take a look at a kind of brief schematic of this. So we have a hot Jupiter rocky planet, an atmosphere that we would like to probe. And during primary transit, some of the light from the star passes through the atmosphere. So the more kind of traditional way to understand the influence of an exoplanet atmosphere on stellar light is called the forward modeling approach. Essentially, the idea would be that you would start from first principles. You would take the laws of physics and principles from chemistry, perhaps even going as far as a full three-dimensional general circulation model to produce a theoretical prediction for how the fraction of starlight as a function of wavelength which is absorbed should look, and that's what we call a transmission spectrum. You can then use your forward model to ask for some telescope time, we get some observations, and hey, you can compare your model to the observations, and by eye, it fits, everyone is happy, and then you publish a paper, and hey, you then go and get your faculty position, and everyone is happy. I simplify a little bit, but that's kind of how, in the early years of exoplanet science, this was addressed. But there's a bit of an issue here, and you can kind of see this by comparing this model with the data. How do you know that the model that you identified is the only solution that can fit the observations? How do you know that there isn't another molecule that could also produce the same kind of absorption signatures? How do you know the temperature you chose is correct? What we want to do at the end of the day is to identify the class of models that can fit a given data set. And that is where retrievals come in. So instead of working forwards from first principles, retrievals take the inverse approach, where we work backwards from the observations as the starting point. And I should say that this is not an alternative to forward modeling. Forward modeling is still vital to couple the understanding of physics and chemistry to the spectra, and of course to get us observing time. Retrieval is just a complementary approach. So what retrievals do is essentially they generate a large suite of model spectra on the order of 100,000 to 1 million or so, and sometimes even more than that. And by using the framework of Bayesian statistics and sampling techniques like MCMC or nested sampling, such as we heard from Josh a few weeks ago, you can map out the parameter space to explore the range of models which can explain your observations. And so, for example, this can give you statistical constraints on the composition of the atmosphere by telling you, say, the range of sodium abundances that can explain a sodium absorption feature. So retrieval has really taken off in the last 10 years, but the rest is pretty much the same from there. Your retrieval code tells you what the atmospheric composition is. Magically, you get a series of papers, and then hopefully you still one day get a faculty position. We can dream. But one of the things that's kind of unfortunate is that, so it's very well understood, the process that we go once we have a model to sample it and explore the parameter space. But retrieval has developed a little bit of a reputation as some kind of magic art going on in this process here. And what I really want to do in this talk is highlight, and there's a reason why I've depicted atmospheric retrieval here as a black box, because it really shouldn't be. We still have to make a large number of assumptions within the model itself that we use. So this is both the atmospheric model and the way that we handle radiative transfer. And this model that we use for retrievals has to be a lot simpler than forward models, because we need to make it computationally efficient enough to be able to evaluate on the order of 100,000 models. So we can't use a general circulation model at the moment within a retrieval framework, because if it takes you a minute or an hour to run a single model, you can't couple it with an MCMC. So there are various simplifying assumptions that go within retrieval codes. I won't go through all of them, but I want to highlight and focus today on this assumption that essentially has been true for almost all of transmission spectra retrievals over the last decade, namely that the atmosphere is one-dimensional. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we compare, for example, a state-of-the-art forward model from a GCM, for example, this one from Christian Helling's recent paper on the ultra-hot Jupiter HAT P7b, we can see from the temperature map that there are strong variations both in longitude and latitude between the day side, the night side, and between the poles. And there are also variations in altitude. But if we compare to state-of-the-art retrieval techniques, we just have a pretty much uniform blob, a single temperature as a function of longitude and latitude. The same thing goes for the chemical abundances. And indeed, many retrieval frameworks also assume that temperature is constant with altitude. So yeah, they're bordering on the edge of zero-dimensional in that context. So the question is, we know that planets are not one-dimensional. So what is the consequence of making these assumptions within retrieval frameworks? And there's an increasing body of literature that has started to answer this question. It was really kicked off by this great paper by Mike Klein and Vivian Parmentier a couple of years ago, which looked at the question of patchy or inhomogeneous clouds. So from an observer's perspective, if you have an atmosphere which is half cloudy and half clear, or has some kind of variable fraction of clear and cloudy, you generate a spectrum with this two-dimensional cloud model, but then you retrieve it with a one-dimensional model. What is the effect? And they showed that, unfortunately, a model with two-dimensional patchy clouds, shown in red here, can produce an almost identical model to a one-dimensional model with a high mean molecular weight, the purple model here, at least in the infrared. But if you expand it out to visible wavelengths, then the degeneracy is lifted and you can tell the difference. So this was just one early indication that if you don't account for the two-dimensional effects, you could still fit the observations, but you might accidentally overestimate the molecular abundances in your atmosphere. So kind of inspired by this work, in a study that I led earlier this year, we extended this to go and consider not just inhomogeneous clouds between the different sides of the terminator, but also to look at what the effect is of different temperature profiles and different chemical abundances between either side. And the main result that we found is that one-dimensional models can still do a pretty decent job of fitting the two-dimensional spectra. There are some residuals that you can see in some cases, but mostly within 1 sigma, you're still fine. But this comes at a cost. You can fit your observations, but the temperature profiles that come out tend to be far colder than the actual physical temperature of the terminator. In the case of ultra-hot Jupiters, this is most extreme. It can be on the order of 1,000 Kelvin colder, the retrieved temperature, from what you actually put into your model. The biases are still present for warm Jupiters and for hot Jupiters, but they're perhaps seen most in terms of the abundances. So in almost all cases, the retrieved abundances were off by 1 sigma. So the true value shown by these solid lines here lay outside of the 1 sigma confidence interval from the retrieval. And in some cases, like for H- here and for methane for this warm Jupiter, you can get your abundances wrong by 3 sigma. And again, I emphasize that these issues are present for a wide variety of planets, The only thing that you need to have is a difference in the chemical composition of a prominent absorber between the morning and evening terminator, but it tends to be most pronounced for ultra-hot Jupiters. And the final bias that I'll touch upon in a nice series of papers by William Pluriel and Anthony Caldas from the Bordeaux group has looked at if you rotate your planet around by 90 degrees, and now imagine looking at the day side and the night side instead of the morning and evening terminator. These nice plots here are to scale. You can see by eye for an ultra-hot Jupiter like a WASP 121, which was modeled here, that the planet is clearly not spherical. The day side is highly inflated due to the high temperatures compared to the night side. And so from the geometric effect of rays coming through the day side, traveling through the terminator and coming out the night side, each ray spends far longer in the day side. And as a consequence, if you fit a two-dimensional spectrum with a day-night gradient, the retrieved one-dimensional temperature tends to come out warmer than the average temperature of the terminator. Terminator temperatures are biased towards the day side, so temperatures can come out too hot. And similarly, for the abundances, if you have a strong gradient in your chemical composition, for example, if you have water which has dissociated on the night side, but is still present on the day side, this can cause your retrieved abundances to also be biased away from the ground truth. And so, for example, carbon to oxygen ratios can be biased. But this is much more of an effect that will be something that we'll have to think about when it comes to James Webb Spectra, because it's currently quite difficult to constrain CO abundances when we don't really have any spectral observations beyond the two Spitzer band passes where CO and CO2 absorb. So we've seen here that east-west differences can cause temperatures to come out too cold, day-night differences can cause them to come out too hot, abundances can be off. So where do we go from here? Should we just give up and just stop doing spectra? Well no. There is a way to overcome these biases, and so I will just kind of give you a preview on some of the developments that are going on in the literature at the moment to try and overcome these, which I've lumped together into the kind of general category that I'm calling multidimensional retrievals. So to give one example of the simplest thing that you can do, to go back to the patchy cloud example that Maitland and Vivian Parmentier first talked about. So if you explicitly include a patchy cloud model within your retrieval framework, just via a simple linear superposition of two one-dimensional models, a clear model and a cloudy model weighted by the cloud fraction. In a study that I led a couple of years ago, we used this patchy cloud model on the real Hubble transmission spectrum from STIS and WST3 of HD209, because this is, at least at the time, was one of the most precise transmission spectra in the literature. And we were curious whether with existing observations, it is possible to actually statistically distinguish between a clear model, a one-dimensional cloudy model, and a two-dimensional patchy cloud model. And we actually found that you can do this quite well. We found that the patchy cloud model is indeed a much better fit, just shy of 5 sigma, compared to a uniform cloud or a clear model. And that you can place a pretty precise constraint on the cloud fraction of around about 50% plus or minus 10%. So the takeaway here is that for some of the most precise transmission spectra that we already have, we can already start to distinguish some two-dimensional models from one-dimensional models. So that's a quite cool finding. And in a nice paper that went upon the archive about a month ago by Brianna Lacey and Adam Burrows, they took the question posed by Anthony Caldas and William Pluriel of these day-night gradients and looked at the question of if you include this in a parameterized form within your retrieval framework, can you retrieve the day side and the night side temperatures and this opening angle across the terminator? And what they showed is that if you have data quality which is commensurate to what James Webb will be able to obtain, you can indeed distinguish between the day side and the night side temperature and place some loose constraints on the opening angle of the terminator, which is certainly a quite exciting result here. There are, of course, many outstanding questions, because this was really the first demonstration in the literature so far of a two-dimensional retrieval technique. So, for example, you see that the day side and the night side were assumed to be isothermal, but what I really want to focus on is that there is still symmetry being assumed here. So this model is still assuming that you have symmetry between the morning and the evening terminators, or the east and the west, if you will. So if you imagine rotating this model about by 360 degrees from the terminator plane, you're still assuming that you have axial symmetry. So the last thing that I thought that I would kind of leave you on is some work that we are doing at the moment in Cornell, where we are looking at how you can develop a fully three-dimensional retrieval framework for transmission spectra, where you can account for temperature profiles in altitude between the day and the night side, between the evening and the morning terminator. Everything here is to scale for an ultra-hot Jupiter. You can do the same for chemical abundances. You can have clouds that are three-dimensional. And the preliminary results that we're finding for JWST quality spectra are very promising. You can distinguish between the temperature profiles in the day and the night side. You can pull out separate abundances between the morning and evening terminators. So this work, which we are hoping to get out there in the next couple of months, we're all very excited by, because what we've essentially found is that if you have a three-dimensional model within your retrieval, all of the previous biases that I've mentioned go away. It is possible, with sufficiently precise observations, to extract these three-dimensional properties from exoplanet transmission spectra. So with that, I would just leave up my key takeaways, which we have here. But if there's any one point that I really, really want to convey, it's that these biases that have been reported for the last few years, we shouldn't see the three-dimensional properties of exoplanet atmospheres as a downside. It shouldn't be something that we should fear. It's a golden opportunity to learn something unprecedented about what is going on in these atmospheres. So with that, I am happy to take a few questions.
All right, let's thank our speaker. All right, I will give an opportunity for people to type their questions into the chat. In the meantime, I saw Bjorn and then Emily. So Bjorn, you can go first. Bjorn, you're muted.
Yeah, very nice talk, Ryan. One thing that we're also experiencing in kind of going down this avenue is that one thing one has to be very careful about, like what we find is that if you demonstrate, let's say, a retrieval on some simulated James Webb observations, that you sometimes can actually get constraints because you produce your simulated observations with exactly the same forward model as you're retrieving from, right? So that you have, it can be very difficult. I think there was even, for example, even let's say in the DeWitt paper which said you can retrieve the mass and stuff like this, people tend to, and even in proposals, tend to use the same exact forward model as they then use to retrieve. And sometimes you can even fit, let's say, some numerical effects. And of course, in some way, your retrieval model will have the best likelihood if you have exactly the same parameters that you put in. But if there are some kind of numerical effects, it could be like a limited resolution or some kind of some things like this, then you actually may be overly optimistic about the things that you can retrieve. How do you have any ways of addressing this?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So you're absolutely right on that point. And so the way that we are planning to address this is by taking a GCM, for example, like the one that I was showing in the animation earlier, where many of the assumptions that the retrieval framework are making clearly are simplistic in comparison. Inject rays which go through the GCM to produce a simulated three-dimensional transmission spectrum, and then apply the retrieval framework to that. And if we do find that the retrieval is then not able to obtain an adequate fit, then we will further develop the retrieval framework. The idea is to iteratively develop this until we can find a retrieval which is general enough to be able to reproduce state-of-the-art GCM spectra. So, so yeah, it's something that we do have to bear in mind, and that's a very important point that you raised there.
Mhm.
All right, Emily Rocher, you're next.
Thank you. My video's not working for some reason, so apologies that I can't smile at you, but that was a lovely talk and lovely science.
Thank you.
I am very excited to see this result. I'm curious if you could provide some more detail into the assumptions that you're making in terms of the functional form of the spatial distribution in your atmosphere, because I'm guessing from your corner plot that you're not just allowing the temperature and chemistry to be anything at every location in the atmosphere, but there's some kind of underlying framework that you're assuming. So I'm curious if you could expand on that.
Yeah, so we have effectively a hierarchy of models such that we can try and find the model which is most applicable to the quality of the data. So this corner plot that I was showing here was for a simplistic model where you assume that you have a sharp boundary between the morning and the evening terminator. So that's why, for example, each of these abundances, like the water abundance here, would be just the abundance on the morning terminator and the abundance on the evening terminator. What I'm showing in the plots here is a more sophisticated model where you parameterize by the abundance on the night side or the day side, and then you have a linear variation in the log abundance between the night side and the day side, and same for the evening and the morning. But you don't have to make this be a linear function. The framework that we're creating is general enough that you can easily have a different functional form. And there is, of course, symmetry, which has been assumed here, that we have a transition region here. You could imagine having a transition region, for example, over here or over here. So we're trying to make it as general as possible, but we probably won't get this right the first time we try, because there hasn't been an attempt to do three-dimensional retrieval for transmission spectra before. So we're very excited to engage with people like yourself who have a lot of experience in GCMs to see how we can improve this iteratively, as I said to Bjorn's question, to get closer and closer to the state-of-the-art simulations. We're just trying to plug the gap between the retrievals and the forward models, essentially. So, so I welcome any suggestions that you have.
Great, thank you.
All right, we're going to move now to the chat questions, and Heather has a question. Heather, do you want to ask it? Otherwise, I can ask it for you if you're unavailable.
No, I can ask it. So I think one thing we always struggle with is the models we would like to fit to the data are not always well constrained by the data. So as to say, you can imagine making a more and more complicated model with more free parameters, but at a certain point, the data just don't really constrain it well enough to justify it. So what kind of data would it take to get good constraints on all model parameters for the sort of demo retrieval that you showed? And is that something that we can routinely expect to get with JWST for a typical hot Jupiter? Or is this kind of, 189 and 209 will work for this, but most other things might be not as great?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I should say that in order to assess which model is most applicable to the data, we're handling this within a nested model comparison framework where you can start with a complicated model, compute the Bayesian evidence or equivalently the BIC for it, and then you can progressively try, for example, a 3D, a 2D, and a 1D model to find where the sweet spot is for a given data set. So what we are finding is that, so this example that we have here was just kind of a toy model where we assumed 20 parts per million noise from 0.6 to about 2 microns. So roughly what you might get for something like nearest SOS, either if you stacked a few transits for, say, a warm Jupiter, or something on the order of the noise floor of what you might get for something like HD 209. But longer wavelength is what really gives us an advantage for James Webb. So even if you don't have a bright target, in fact, if you have a dim target that you can observe with the NIRSPEC prism and get spectra from 0.6 all the way out to about 5 microns, then we do find that even for dimmer targets, you can constrain these parameters. We have even tried a version of some of these 2D retrieval frameworks on existing spectra. And I won't go too much into the detail, but For some spectra which have already been published, we do find a preference for some of the two-dimensional models, but not yet the 3D models. So if Hubble is already on the precipice of being able to distinguish between some of these models, I'm very optimistic for what James Webb will be able to do for us. But we'll go into that in extensive detail in our paper, kind of showing how good the data has to be able to tell, say, a 2D model apart from a 3D model.
All right, I think we're going to have to transition over to our next speaker. So let's thank Ryan again. Ryan, if you could go back to the chat, there's a bunch of questions there for you. Feel free to address them as you are available. Thank you, Ryan. Okay, Megan?
Yeah, share my screen.
All right, next we have Megan Mansfield from University of Chicago.
Yeah, so thank you all for the chance to give a talk here today. So today I'm going to be talking about the eigenspectra method, which is a method that myself and a group of collaborators have developed for identifying spectra from 3D eclipse mapping observations with James Webb. So before I even begin, I just wanted to acknowledge everyone who's worked on this project with me. One of my favorite parts of working on this project has been that it's really been a collaboration between a bunch of different people spread out at a bunch of different institutions, and it's been really fun having this group to work with over the past year or so. I also wanted to acknowledge the University of Michigan for hosting the workshop where we all met up and actually started discussing what eventually turned into this project. Okay, so before I go into detail on exactly what our project looks at, I just wanted to kind of give some background on how eclipse mapping observations work. So I'm really excited that I actually ended up getting to talk on the same day as Ryan now, because the whole idea of eclipse mapping is this concept that these planets are not just 1D and they have a lot of variation over their surfaces. So what you do in eclipse mapping is you do your normal secondary eclipse observations, but instead of just looking at that flux difference that you get in your full eclipse in the center, you instead really carefully measure the ingress and egress of the eclipse when the planet is moving behind the star and then reappearing on the other side of the star. So if you observe carefully during those time periods, you can watch segments of your planet disappear behind the star one by one, and then segments of your planet reappear on the other side. And then by combining that information, you can get a 2D map of the day side of the planet. So this has been done once before using observations from the Spitzer Space Telescope. So here I'm showing one map from an interpretation of those observations, which were on HD 189. And so basically what these observations gave was this map that is resolved in latitude and longitude, but because it was observing with Spitzer, it was at a single wavelength, one broad photometric band. So we basically get this broadband photometric map at this one wavelength. With James Webb, however, we're going to be able to expand this even more, because for some of the best hot Jupiter targets that we'll look at with James Webb, we'll be able to do spectroscopic eclipse mapping. So we won't just be observing at a single wavelength, we'll be observing these planets at a lot of different wavelengths. And then we can create an eclipse map at each of those wavelengths. So this will actually give us the ability to observe these planets on their day sides in 3 dimensions: latitude, longitude, and wavelength, altitude, pressure, whatever your preferred up and down coordinate is. But it's not super straightforward to interpret these observations. There's a lot of degeneracies in the information that you're getting out of eclipse mapping observations. And that's basically because what you're observing when you look at a secondary eclipse is flux over time as your planet goes into the eclipse. And what we want to get out from that is a spatial distribution of flux over latitude and longitude. So when you're trying to convert between those two pieces of information, there's degeneracies with things like the orbital parameters of the planet. So we wanted to look at how we can best extract the maximum information from these spectroscopic eclipse mapping observations. So this idea of trying to figure out how to get this information from eclipse mapping observations came up, as I said, at this conference at University of Michigan a couple years ago. Here's a photo from that conference where I've pointed out all of the people who ended up being involved in this collaboration. And what we started discussing there led to the development of what I'm going to present to you today, which is this eigenspectra mapping method, which is a way to address some of these degeneracies in these observations. So here I'm just showing an overview of this method, and I'm going to go through each of these steps in individual detail. But the basic idea behind this project was that we wanted a way to identify flux patterns in these spectroscopic eclipse mapping observations without making any assumptions that those patterns follow the circulation models that we already have. All right, so the first step is you observe a secondary eclipse with James Webb. It gives you this beautiful detailed secondary eclipse data. So we get flux over time at a bunch of different wavelengths. And we'd like to take those measurements and look for spatial flux patterns across our planet without assuming that those flux patterns look like any of our previous models that we've made. And the reason that we wanted to do this is because there have been several times that you can think of probably in the history of exoplanets where what we've observed has completely surprised us, and we've kind of had to go back and reevaluate our models and figure out what we can do to explain what we saw in our observations. So we really wanted a way to look at these planets' day sides and look for the flux patterns on their day sides without being influenced by what we expect to see on these planets. Okay, so the second step then is we take each of those secondary eclipse light curves, and we use the eigencurves method, which was developed by Emily Rauscher, to make a map of the planet at each of those wavelengths we've observed at. So basically how this method works is we use PCA to make an orthogonal basis of light curves, which are shown in the top row of this figure here. And then we use those light curves to fit our secondary eclipse light curve and back out the map of the planet from that. The reason this step is necessary is because this orthogonal basis of those light curves in the flux versus time space is not the same as an orthogonal basis of maps in your flux over latitude and longitude. And so we do it this way to avoid any degeneracies in what our output map looks like. All right, so then at the end of that step, we've got basically a map that's resolved in latitude and longitude at each different wavelength we've observed at. And we stack all those maps together to make one 3D spatial and spectral map, where our 3 dimensions here now are latitude, longitude, and wavelength. So then we use, we take our planet map and we divide it up into a grid in latitude and longitude. From each point on that grid, we extract out a spectrum. And then we use a k-means clustering algorithm to identify regions of our planet's map that have similarly shaped spectra, which we refer to as groups. And then from each of those groups, we take all of the spectra from all of the different grid points that were sorted into that group and take the mean of all of those spectra as the representative spectrum of that group, which we call an eigenspectrum. So the reason that we do this step is because you could imagine just taking your maps of your secondary eclipse and then dividing up your planet in a grid in latitude and longitude, and then taking a spectrum from each point in that grid and running all of those spectra through an atmospheric retrieval code or something similar to try and understand what the composition of the day side is. But there's a couple problems that you would have with that. The first is that you're taking a lot of spectra from a lot of different grid points, so you'd have a lot of spectra to run through your atmospheric retrieval. And the second is each of those spectra would have a relatively low signal to noise because you're really only capturing a small amount of the flux from the day side in each spectrum. And so you'd be only getting a really small amount of the information you get from your whole secondary eclipse in each spectrum, so they'd have really big error bars. So by using this k-means clustering algorithm, we can group together similar spectra so that you have less spectra to run through an atmospheric retrieval. And also the error bars on each of those individual spectra are smaller, while still ensuring that you get a good idea of the variance of different types of spectra across the map of the planet by having these different separate groups which have separately shaped spectra. All right, so that's the basics of how our method works. So now I just wanted to go through an example of how we applied this method to some simulated James Webb observations and what we got out of that. So the example I'm going to be going over is what we call the gradient hotspot. So here on the left-hand side, I'm showing the map of the day side that we input into this model. And then on the right-hand side are spectra, where the colors of each of these spectra correspond to the region where they were painted on to this map on the day side of this planet. So basically what this is it's a hotspot that's centered at the substellar point, which is at 0 degrees in latitude and longitude here. And then there's concentric circles of spectra around that are decreasingly colder and colder until you get all the way to the limb of the planet, which has the coolest spectrum. So when we feed this gradient hotspot through our eigenspectrum method, here's what we get out at the end. So this left-hand plot is just showing the flux as a function of latitude and longitude in our output map. And then this center plot shows those two groups that we identify from the k-means clustering. And these dashed lines printed over it show the contours of some of those regions of the original gradient that we put in. And then on the right-hand side here is the secondary eclipse spectra for these solid lines with the error bars are for the two groups that we extract from our output map. And then all of these dotted lines are the spectra that we input onto the original gradiated hotspot. So the first thing that you can see from looking at this is that this method is generally able to identify the large-scale gradients and overall shape of the planet map. So it picks up on the fact that there's a central hotspot and that that region has a warmer flux than the surrounding area. It gets the general shape of these spectra that we've put in correct. So it's in general able to identify this large scale structure of the planet's map. So just quickly, I wanted to mention a couple limitations to this mapping method. The first is that it can't model sharp discontinuities as well as it can model those smooth gradients of flux distributions. And also it's best at identifying maps that are symmetric about the substellar point as opposed to those that have asymmetric flux patterns. But we don't expect this to be a big problem because we expect from our modeling of hot Jupiters that the planets that we would realistically be applying to this should smoothly vary in their properties across the day side. So here I'm just showing two different outputs from different circulation models for two different planets at different temperature points in this hot Jupiter regime where we would be applying this method. On the left-hand side here is a map of the brightness temperature of WASP 43, which is a relatively cool hot Jupiter that we could use this method for. And then on the right-hand side is the water abundance from a model of Kelp 20, which is a relatively warm hot Jupiter. So you can see in both of these cases, these properties smoothly vary and we don't see any sharp discontinuities across the planet's day sides. So we expect in those cases that our eigenspectrum method would be useful for picking out those large scale gradients in these properties. So I also wanted to point out another thing that we think that this method would be very useful for, which is that we can use it to determine the observability of the features that you see in your circulation models. So basically how that would work is you'd take your circulation model with some property that you'd like to observe with JWST, and you would feed it through our pipeline, make those synthetic secondary eclipse light curves exactly like we did for testing our pipeline. And then at the end, you would get output this map with the different spectra you'd be able to observe. And that would give you an idea of what scale of features you'd be able to observe in a secondary eclipse observation, and also what precision you need to observe at to be able to distinguish the different spectral features that you'd like to look at. So just to wrap up the conclusions from this, we developed this eigenspectrum method, which is going to be used to extract information from spectroscopic eclipse maps that you'll be able to make with JWST without relying on any prior expectations of the flux patterns that you would observe based on previous circulation models. We found that this method is generally able to identify the broad shape of the flux pattern across the day side of these planets. It struggles with discontinuities and asymmetric maps, but we don't expect those to be super prevalent on these hot Jupiters. And we think that this method would be useful for two different types of things. The first is it could kind of be a first look observation to identify those large scale gradients and flux patterns across the day side. And then you could use those identified patterns in combination with some more physical models like a GCM or something to kind of get a better idea of the physics that is driving the patterns you see in your observations. And then the second is you could use it to evaluate what patterns in your circulation models would be observable so that you would know at what level of precision you'd have to observe to see the features you're interested in seeing. So finally, just quickly before I end, I wanted to mention that this code is intended to be a fully open source thing that anyone could use for interpreting their spectroscopic eclipse mapping observations. It is going to be available on GitHub. It is currently on GitHub right now, but I would strongly recommend that you don't download it yet because there's very little documentation or instructions and it's probably going to be very confusing. But we're actively working on developing that to make it more user-friendly. So hopefully by the time we have secondary eclipse mapping observations with James Webb, this package will be able to just be downloaded. So thanks again for having me to speak today, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, let's thank our speaker. Thank you, Megan. All right, now is the time to start posting your chat questions into the chat or to raise your hand. I'll start things off with actually a repeat of Heather's question for Ryan. Do you have any sense of what the data quality or wavelength coverage or maybe SNR might be that you would need in order to pull out the information from, for example, a hotspot or maybe with one of the chevron shapes for WASP 43b? What do we need for James Webb?
Yeah, so the one test we've really done so far was with HD 189. We were observing with, I think it was one of the near spec instruments that we looked at, but basically we were using like 2 micron-ish wide wavelength region and breaking that up into just like 10 wavelength bands. So this method is most useful really for looking at those large scale distributions because you could really probably get information on 2 or 3 groups over like maybe 10 wavelength bands. So it's a little bit more of a like lower resolution spectra from, and more chunky bits over the day side of your planet. But we do think that you would be able to do that with not just HD 189, like you should be able to do that for other hot Jupiters as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're going to go in order of Natalie, Caroline, and then Zach. So Natalie, you're up first.
Megan, thanks for the talk. I'm so fascinated by this idea of latitudinal information. When we do Doppler tomography of stars and their sunspots, their star spots, we have that issue as well, breaking that symmetry. I'm wondering how the latitudinal information manifests itself in the data. But then also I'm wondering if it does, is that a way to get the obliquity of the planet? Because when we do Doppler tomography of stars, it's the inclination of the spin axis which actually breaks the degeneracy.
Yeah, so for that point that I said about, hold on, I have something. Yeah, for how well we can see asymmetric things, the latitudinal distribution. So we actually found, here was an example of how you could, like we tested out asymmetric hotspot basically, which was offset in longitude and latitude. So it was like in this region here. And we did actually find that this method was able to identify that there was an offset hotspot. The reason that I said it's best at those symmetric maps is because of the way we're constructing these maps using that eigencurves method. Most of the information is coming from the first few eigencurves, which are all really large scale patterns. They're all constructed from spherical harmonics too, basically. So they're large scale patterns like a central hotspot, something that's, bimodal in latitude, bimodal in longitude. So when you combine the first few of those eigenspectra, you inherently are kind of limited to getting those symmetric maps. So in this case, it picked up that there was an asymmetric, hotspot over here, but it also grouped in this, like, we called it a ghost hotspot because it was forced into making a map that was pretty symmetric about the substellar point. But you could still use something like this to then say, okay, we see this weird pattern where, you know, one region in this like upper corner is warmer, and then maybe you could use some other models to see if a model with a hotspot that was offset in latitude or something would fit those data well. As far as using that to constrain obliquity, Emily Rauscher has done some work on using these types of observations, eclipse mapping, to constrain obliquity and things like that, because that is all actually, since what you're really looking at is small changes in the ingress and egress, there is information wrapped up in there about the planet's orbital parameters as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
All right, Caroline.
Yeah, hi, that was a great talk, Megan. I really enjoyed it. I have a question. I'm not familiar with the k-means clustering algorithm that you've been using, but all of the examples showed dividing the data kind of into these two groups. I was wondering if it's possible for there to be another group, like, and how would you tell if there's like a statistically significant reason to put in an extra group?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so the way that we wrote this code was basically you set how many groups the clustering algorithm is trying to sort your data into. And then what we did when we were making these test maps was we basically started with a small number of groups and then slowly stepped up one by one until we got to a situation where the clustering algorithm didn't really know how to divide those groups. And this kind of shows how we defined that. So when we sorted our data into two groups for this map, this was a slightly different hotspot map, but similar. So when we were trying to tell it cluster the data into two groups, we were basically taking a bunch of different realizations of this map from steps in an MCMC and doing the k-means clustering on each realization. So when we had two groups, all of the points were really clearly sorted as always being in group 0 or always being in group 1. But then when we added a third group, it was basically for different realizations of the map, grouping different points into different groups. So like the color scale on this is the mean group number that they were sorted into, and you don't get like just 0 or just 1 anymore, it's all mixed up. And then these little histograms show individually for different points what group they were sorted into, and you can see that that's kind of mixed between the different steps. So we kind of used that as a metric of when we didn't have a high enough signal to separate out more groups.
Got it, thanks.
All right, we have two questions on the chat, starting with Zach and then Hannah.
Thanks, Megan. This is so exciting. And so if I understand it correctly, this is like super duper flexible in that you can have basically any shape regions and you can have basically any shape spectra for those regions. Is that right?
Yeah, that is hypothetically true, although it's limited by what I said before. Those we're constructing this from the eigencurves, and so you tend to get those symmetric maps out of that here. So this shows like, these are maps for the individual eigencurves here. So you can see you get like a hotspot on the day side and then like 2 different and then, you know, 2 different in the other direction and then 4. So when you're using just the first few eigencurves to make these maps, you're kind of limited in what spatial distributions you can get that way. But you can get out pretty much, you can feed any like spectral shapes into this. And yeah, it's the clustering is just sorting by, it's looking at you like the flux level and the shape of the spectrum, but it'll just sort them into whatever looks similar, no matter what they actually look like.
Cool. And so I was wondering if you can and if you gain anything by making some like stronger assumptions about the spectra of these regions. Like in a lot of cases, you could probably say like it's going to look like a Planck spectrum of one temperature, and so there you're kind of like fitting for one thing, you know, inferring one thing instead of inferring the super like having to rederive the Planck function from your spectrum itself. Can you do that?
You definitely could do that, and that would probably be really useful, particularly for getting you past this. We can only get maps that have certain flux distributions on them problem, because so basically you could do this first as like a totally model independent way of doing it. And then if you wanted to, you could feed in some prior information on like, okay, I expect that this map has a single hotspot and that hotspot is, you know, relatively kind of black body-like in its emission and it's hotter than the surrounding area. And you could feed in a lot of information like that and use that to get out a, you know, better constrained map.
Cool.
All right, we have time for at least one more. So Hannah, you're up next.
Caroline asked a far more sophisticated version of the question I had about the groups.
Very good. All right. Then let's go on. I think I saw Mark throw his hand up next.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the talk. So a related question to one earlier. With the maps that you're showing on this current slide, did you say that it would be possible to use sort of any set of maps as your kind of priors?
Yeah, so the reason that we use this set of maps to fit it is you could basically construct a way to fit your light curves with any set of maps. But this set of maps in particular is the one that we wanted to use because they make this orthogonal basis in that secondary eclipse light curve space. So you wouldn't run into degeneracies between like two different maps basically giving you the same secondary eclipse light curve. Right,
because I was wondering if it could be possible to use, you know, from a kind of fluid dynamics point of view, you could maybe come up with a more sort of physically motivated set of maps that might even need fewer. You know, you could say that this would be built from sort of 3 or 4 different main circulation components. But I guess you might run into problems with degeneracy there.
Yeah, you could, so you could take, one thing you could do is you could take your set of maps that have your different physical parameters or whatever and use the same PCA method to get an orthogonal basis of light curves that are made from that set of maps. This one, the light curves are all just based on combining spherical harmonics in different ways. So you could take like a set of maps that aren't spherical harmonics and still go through the same process. Yeah, the reason we did it this way was just because we wanted to be totally GCM independent, basically.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, one more question. Bjorn, take it away.
Yes, yeah, I mean, you made a very nice point that this is like a model independent way of getting these eigenspectra, these eigen curves out. In the end, when you have an eigenspectrum, and you actually, let's say, one reason is that you would combine lots of data to get an eigenspectrum. Maybe you have like 2 or 3 main eigenspectra, so that you don't have higher signal noise. But are these eigenspectra necessarily physical models? Or so, for example, if we wanted to apply a retrieval on these eigenspectra, isn't there also a chance that these models would have something in there that doesn't correspond to a 1D physical model anymore? So if you did a retrieval, you would try to fit something that actually makes no physical sense for a 1D model. Is that a challenge?
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess I think what you're getting at, which tell me if I'm not answering your question, is that we're still relying on getting these 2 or 3 spectra from grouping our dayside into like 2 or 3 major groups, but still even within those groups, there could be some variation, just not at the level that we can detect basically in our data. And so you still could end up with situations where a 1D model isn't enough, which is actually a way that this ties in really nicely to what Ryan's working on, because you could still have a lot of variation over the region that you've grouped all into one group. So maybe it would be more useful to model that in 2D or however many dimensions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is, for example, we see sometimes in data analysis. For example, if we analyze high resolution data, we're using PCA components to remove certain effects. And often it looks like that maybe the first effect is the one by air mass, the second effect is some instrumental effect and things like this. But sometimes the PCA components may have no meaning whatsoever. And is it possible in this scenario that you get an eigenspectrum out which maybe does not correspond to any particular location on the planet?
So they are, the way that we're doing this clustering, it is tied to the locations on the planet actually. So you get out the information of what that spectrum looks like and what actual locations on the planet are like giving you that information, basically. So they are actually all tied kind of to somewhere on the planet.
Okay, thank you.
All right, that's all the time we have for the formal session. So let's thank Megan again. All right, and we'll stop the recording and move into our less formal discussion session. You're welcome to hang around if you would like. Both Megan and Ryan will be around to answer questions if you want or still have them. And if not, thank you for attending, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.